Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline, and I'm here today with Chrys Kub. Chrys is a yoga therapist and experienced yoga teacher. She received her master's degree in physical therapy and biokinesiology from the University of Southern California. She's an integrative physical therapist with over 25 years of clinical experience. Chrys is also an ACE certified personal trainer, so her background is quite varied. In addition to teaching therapeutic yoga throughout the US and training yoga teachers, Chrys has her own integrative PT practice called Fit Yoga Therapy. So welcome, Chrys. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
So one of your areas of expertise intersects with what I think of as a really common misperception in the yoga world, and that has to do with the position or the placement of the concept of stretching in asana practice. This is a bit of an overgeneralization, but a lot of people come into yoga thinking that the goal of yoga is to stretch, and that the meaning of yoga is to pull yourself into positions where you're going into as far as you can go into a position and holding on, for dear life. And that stretching in yoga is the answer to all your problems, that you can solve any problem with a stretch. So could we start, because I know you are an expert in this particular area, can we just talk about this whole thing from a big picture of what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that misperception? Let's go there first.
Okay. So when I have students come up to me and ask me for a stretch, for a discomfort, a lot of times people will come to yoga because their physician or healthcare professional has sent them to yoga, which is great for us as yoga teachers and yoga therapists. But they may come to me and ask, hey, can you show me a stretch for my low back? My back hurts, or my shoulder hurts. And what I start thinking at that point, yes, I certainly could show you a stretch, but I want to know why you're having discomfort in that area, because that may indicate a need not to stretch, but actually to strengthen that area. So that's where my curiosity comes in as a yoga teacher. And there's a particular syndrome that a lot of people come to yoga to do stretches for, which is sciatica. So a lot of people will say, oh, I've been diagnosed with sciatica, or I just have a pain running down my leg. I need to stretch my hip. And many times that sciatica could be caused by a bulging disc, which is where you don't want to overstretch the low back, which is a flexion movement, which a lot of people do for piriformis. Or you might actually want to stretch it because that muscle, that little piriformis muscle that goes around the sciatic nerve, is too tight. And in that case, yes, you would want to know some stretches, but also it could be from weakness in the area. If you're very sedentary, or if you sit with your leg crossed a long time, that muscle can get overstretched. But the beauty of yoga and why I love it so much is that it is more than stretching. It's actually working all areas of the body and balancing them out. And a lot of times we may want to strengthen the area to help it. And in addition to that, as we all know, if you're a yoga teacher, it's more than just the physical aspect. So what else is going on with them that might cause them to feel the need to relax their body, and what is it that they need to do that? It might not be getting in a certain position, because perhaps, I don't know about you, but I have tight hamstrings, for example, and that's very common in people. And I've been stretching them for 30 years and they still at times feel very stiff, especially on one side. So if I just do a stretching posture where I move into that posture without incorporating mindfulness and breathing and things that help me relax my nervous system or shift my nervous system, then all that position of that forward fold isn't really going to change the feeling in my body. So I like to be more curious as to not only what's causing that sensation to need to feel like they're stretching, but also what else can I get from yoga that may benefit me other than just stretching, which is a lot, as I think we all know as yoga teachers.
Yeah, you brought something up. I think that's really important. And it has to do with the very definition of stretching, because when you were talking about piriformis, what was going through my head is you'd want to be doing something targeted. You'd want to be contracting and releasing. You'd want to be, that idea that stretching is one thing. And the problem with that notion is that I think science has come up with a whole bunch of ways that stretching is beneficial, but all kinds of stretching that isn't. It put your legs apart and put your nose on the floor and hold on for dear life. So there's a lot of different kinds of stretching that don't necessarily look like what we think of when we think of stretching.
That's true. That's true.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we think of stretching, most of the time people think, like the common phrase a lot of us hear is, I don't want to go to yoga, I'm too tight, or I'm not flexible, I can't do
Can't
it.
touch my toes.
We're like, well, that's why you should come. But the full expression of a deep stretch, which we might do, that as you described, is one type of stretching. You're doing full range of motion, it's passive, and you're holding it. Can feel really good. It can actually give you time to relax that area and get a little bit more movement, is great. But there's also different ways that we can stretch that help us with functional activities, such as being able to throw a baseball if you're a baseball player, or get ready to run if you're a runner. And if you're getting ready to do like a dynamic activity, one of the myths is I need to stretch before I run, or I need to stretch before I, swing that golf club. And actually, if you do long passive stretching before a sports activity, they've shown in research that that can actually decrease the ability of your body to fire those muscles that you just stretched. So instead, you might want to do what we call dynamic stretching, which would be more movement while you're stretching in and out versus holding. So we want to know, why do we want to stretch? What's the purpose? What do we want to do with that? And that's how we decide which type of stretching we might want to do, depending on our purpose for that. And also, a lot of people who come to yoga tend to be already flexible. As I said, the inflexible stay away from it.
Yeah.
And yeah. So is
I was thinking there's like the two camps. There's the people who are super flexible and they want to come to yoga and do more. And that's not great.
Yeah.
And they're the people who are super inflexible and they are resistant to coming to yoga because they think they're going to be asked to put their legs wide and come put their nose on the floor. And that's not great either. How do you find, the sweet spot? Because there are so many ways to address that concept of resilience and extensibility and fluidity and flexibility in muscle that go beyond that one idea of what is stretching.
I think in my experience, people benefit from education while you're working with them, whether it's a one-on-one session or in a class, and just explaining to them as they're doing different movements, different asanas, or if you're just talking about what yoga is, like what is happening in this particular asana or movement. If you are working on increasing that extensibility, then maybe you're explaining to them how holding the position longer, being aware and present in the sensations that you're feeling so that they know where to feel it, and also what is the right feeling and what is maybe not the most helpful feeling, will help them understand how that is addressing their issues or what they want. Or, I love when we're moving in certain poses that require a lot of strength. Let's say, example, going from, let's say warrior 3, and maybe you're moving into a standing split where you're lifting the leg higher. One is more like a dynamic, like holding isometric movement. And then as you're lifting the leg, you're actually lengthening the standing leg muscles, but you're also strengthening that leg that you're lifting up. So you're getting the benefit of so much more than just if you were like doing a passive split on the floor. So it's really fun to kind of tell them, yeah, your glutes are getting strong here as you're feeling that lengthening in the back of your standing leg. And that's like, yay, I'm doing a lot for my body at one time, and I'm aware of it and feeling it.
Yeah, I think that potential for strengthening and lengthening, the working into that, if you want to go with the eccentric phase of the movement, that you can be lengthening and strengthening at the same time is kind of a surprising notion
Yes,
to a lot of people. That
100%.
stretching can strengthen if you do it right.
Yes, for sure.
And it's a lot more interesting too, isn't it?
Yes. And, and then if you do have people who are more athletic in your class, it gives them a little bit more confidence in that they feel like, wow, well, I'm already strong, so this is something I can do. And they feel more successful and more empowered versus coming to a practice and feeling I can't do like the other person over there who's in a fuller expression of the pose. I will be like, well, that's because you're strong, that you can't get your foot way back there. You actually have the strength and can, like standing big toe pose, which is a wonderful pose to kind of focus that on, have them, of course, stand and hold their toe either with a strap or their fingers around their big toe, then ask them to let go, which is a classical expression of that. Can they keep their leg up at that same height? That's the difference between their flexibility and their strength. If they can't keep their leg up at that same height they had passively held it, then that's just showing them that they can have an opportunity to get stronger in those muscles that hold the leg up. So it's kind of a fun little trick.
That they have the length and they could catch up.
Yes, they could gain the strength, and then that would be more helpful to them in real life to be strong and flexible versus just flexible.
Yeah, I'm so glad you just said that. The idea that being flexible out of context with everything else in your life is useful or beneficial or in any way desirable, but part of, and I think maybe you could speak to the way that you work with stretching, but part of it is to create a diet, a varied diet of all the kinds of stretching in all of the places where we need to be stretching, and not like the familiar sort of hanging on our ligaments in a forward fold, that there's really a lot of benefit you could derive if you work with nuance and variety. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, because I know you've worked with tons of clients in that realm.
Yeah, and as a physical therapist, I work with people who have injuries, and certainly we look at what's causing the injury or the discomfort, unless it was a traumatic injury. And then also in personal training, a lot of my clients maybe come in either deconditioned, where they need to strengthen and increase their muscle action, so they need more movement, or they become in stiff and tight and without awareness. And sometimes it's not just the soft tissue that's stiff, the fascia or the muscle, it's actually the joint itself. And how can they figure that out, so that they may want to first work on joint mobility before they try to even move into the stretching. So yeah, I think a lot of it is really knowing what in your body you particularly need as an individual versus more of a overall, just everybody needs to be flexible.
Right.
Yeah.
And everybody needs to do more, no matter how far you can get your nose toward your knee, everyone's trying to go further.
That's true. That's true. Further, it's like trying not to overemphasize the benefits of flexibility or the virtues of flexibility. We don't want to demonize it either. We don't want to say, oh, it's bad to put your foot behind your head. Yeah, if you can put your foot behind your head with good awareness and muscle engagement, and can you hold it there, or are you cranking it back there and using like leverage? The difference between those two things, that I think is more important, because it's fun to put your foot behind your head sometimes and try something that's more challenging. Are you doing it with a way that's going to help your body stay healthy and strong? too.
Yeah, arguably, I would say if you can easily put your foot behind your head, you don't need to put your foot behind your head. You need to do something else.
Yeah.
I always tell people in my yoga classes that if something is really, really easy for them, they probably don't need it.
Yes, exactly. Because you hate the most.
Pose that they
because you
hate
need
is
to do
probably the
most.
pose that they need. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
You also talked about something else. I don't know if this speaks to kind of the nervous system or the neuromuscular, what's really going on, but I want to talk about perception versus reality.
Mhm.
When we go to a yoga class and we do a great, vigorous, full-bodied, fulsome practice, and we're doing active dynamic stretching, we're going through the range, are we actually lengthening our muscles, or are we telling ourselves that we've lengthened our muscles because we're standing up straighter, we're breathing better? And is there any, can you actually lengthen muscle fiber in a yoga class? I guess that's my question.
And it's really a matter of semantics. And I wrestle with, does it matter if people think their muscles are longer? In the general population, no. But if you're more of a science nerd or anatomy nerd, kinesiology nerd like me, we want to know, well, are you lengthening? So if you look at the research, basically it's showing that in a lot of these different stretches that we're doing, especially the more long held stretches, the more deeper stretches that we're like holding for longer periods of time, that the muscle itself and the fascia isn't really changing in its actual length, but our perception of how it feels change, which is really what we want anyway. So you feel more fluid after, let's say, for example, your first sun salutation. The next time you do a forward fold, you're like, wow, I started class, I couldn't touch my toes. After that sun salutation, now I can touch my toes. I just got more flexible. Well, if that's, your perception, that's fine. I got my hamstrings got longer. But in reality, what happened is your nervous system realized that you were safe and you had been there before. You were breathing slowly. You were kind of working on that presence and awareness, and that the nervous system started saying, hey, I can let go of tension in this area. It's okay. And it's going to lengthen the extensibility or allow the extensibility of the muscle versus changing the length. Like basically unless you're in an accident or have been immobilized, the length of your muscle is not going to change that much just by a few stretches in a yoga class. You can lengthen that muscle, but it takes a lot of focused effort, and the difference is going to be not a huge difference. And it's going to be from eccentric stretching and strengthening. That's going to actually change the length of the muscle, or something more aggressive, such as serial casting or a limb lengthening procedure that they would do, in a medical reason.
Yeah. Not our lane.
Right.
Teachers, not our lane.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. And when you were talking, I was thinking about what you said earlier, which is you are getting more range of motion in your joint because you're redistributing synovial fluid.
Mhm.
You're letting go of, you might be releasing of some adhesions in the fascial network. You might be letting go of some chronic problem that you hold in that one area of your body. You might be creating a much better reality without changing the length of your muscles.
Right. Without a huge physiological change. But, it doesn't matter.
That's what you're saying. It doesn't matter.
Let's say I don't know why I keep coming to baseball players, but because I don't know really much about baseball, but I know when they throw, you notice how much their arm moves and how much range of motion. I think it's because I was watching the women's softball in the Olympics. Certainly that's a sport where you would want a longer, more extensible shoulder. So they would really focus on eccentric training and trying to get that for that sport. It's more of a sport specific thing. But in yoga,
it's also over time, right? It's not
yes
once a week, twice a week yoga class. That is dedicated. Am I wrong, or is that?
Yes, that's true. I mean, yes, exactly. It's what they call in the research chronic stretching, where you're stretching continually over time, purposefully. And in our yoga classes, we don't have enough load really, which is the resistance to really do that. And, you know, there's no really reason for it. But what you are doing is creating more fluidity. I love the word fluidity. It's like when you get up early in the morning and get out of bed, especially as you move into your 50s and 60s or above, you feel stiffer because your body has less of that fluidity. But if you do some gentle movement before you even get out of bed, you feel more fluid. So what's happening, right? What's happening? And that's what yoga does. It helps us feel more fluid, it's more easeful in our movements. So to me, that's the benefit of moving into those postures and taking your body into positions that it doesn't normally maybe go in, which may be certain angles of movement and directions, that because we're such a forward flexion society. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I was thinking of like a pose, like a triangle pose, where if you've done a great warm up and you're radiating out from your center, and it feels very exhilarating.
Yes.
And it doesn't matter if you are just feeling longer versus whether you actually are longer. It's a really exhilarating way to be.
100%. Yes. And that's, you know, that's the essence of yoga practice, where if you're just doing a stretch in the gym in the doorway, you might feel maybe a little bit more fluid, but it's nothing like how you feel after you're in a open asana, where you're breathing and really being in that moment, like you said, and feeling the energetics of it versus just the physicality of it, for sure.
And then if we could talk for a minute about triangle pose, because I think triangle pose is a wonderful example of your stretching and strengthening, and it's an all over. I feel the same way. The one pose, I always say that if you're going to only do one pose, people call it awkward chair. I prefer the other name, fierce pose, Utkatasana. You're in a stress position, but to be in that position all the way, you've got to stretch, right? You've got to be, but that's not a static stretch necessarily. That's a different, right?
Right. Yeah. I would never think, or most people, I would say either would think Utkatasana is a stretch pose, but you are lengthening your glutes, you're lengthening the front body as you reach up. So you're in every pose, frankly, you're getting a lengthening of some areas and a strengthening of other areas and a balancing, unless you're in a passive supine or prone, you know, yin pose, where the purpose is totally different. So yeah.
Now, you talked about forward bending, and a lot of people think forward bending is everything in terms of, are you stretchy? Can you bend all the way over? And that always brings up the question of ligaments and tendons and the need to not stretch those. But can you actually not stretch those, since they're connected and invested and part of the fascial network? Can you just talk about how people in yoga class should take care of their tendons and ligaments when it comes to going into some extreme-ish positions?
Yes, and I think sometimes deep stretch classes are popular. Yin yoga is very popular, and you can passively create what they call creep. So if you're in a position for a longer period of time, over time, you'll still get changes in the extensibility of, let's say, a ligament. And then if you put force on that, such as, you know, a lot of body weight, then you can get to the point where it changes from that place where it can come back to a place where it has what they call plastic deformation, or maybe even rupture or damage. So I think being in a posture with, again, as it goes back to awareness of not just hanging out, but actually maybe having a little bit of support, so that you're controlling the amount of load and force on that area, so you don't put too much stress on a ligament or a tendon inadvertently by the position you're in.
That kind of speaks to, I want to use the word control. Maybe that's not the right word, but controlling I'll say it my way and then you'll correct me. But let's go to that. You got your legs open on the floor and you're coming forward. You're controlling it. So you're using more muscle, you're using more tone, and you're not letting yourself go to a hurty place where you can feel a pull or a burning or a, I always say to my students, if you hear a ripping sound, you went a little too far.
Yeah. That's great then.
But how do I guess that's that mindful quality that you were talking about, when the way you approach your come into poses and go out of them.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to understand that people have different abilities to feel sensation. And they have shown through the research that the people who are super flexible, hyper flexible, actually have less ability to feel that end range of motion and tend to be able to go past that place that is safe. So I usually tell my students who are hyper flexible to really be more engaged and not to go to the end, because they may be going past where their body can give them a signal of safety. The body just doesn't feel like a person who's got more stiffness. Their body's like, no, don't go there. So they have to practice, not paying so much attention to those signals and breathing and letting go of that body's resistance, where the hyperflexible people, might need to be more diligent in saying, okay, maybe I need to engage here a little bit more versus just totally falling into my extreme flexibility, because my body can't tell me when I've gone too far. It literally doesn't have that ability.
But if they're doing one of the other forms of the dynamic or active or PNF, they're doing some other form of stretching.
Yes.
And they're not focused on what the picture looks like.
Right.
Then those people, because they do say that people who are hyperflexible get injured more than the tight people. You would think it was the opposite, but it isn't. The tight people are safe.
Yeah, your body's giving you lots of signals saying, be careful, don't go there. Where the more hyperflexible, their body's like, I can't feel that, so keep going. And unfortunately, they end up maybe going too far because they just don't know. They know nothing in their body gave them a caution. So they have to even be more like aware of what's a safe place to go.
And their yoga teachers really need to understand that as well, don't they?
Yes, I think as a yoga teacher, a lot of times they're like, oh, that's too much science. I don't want to know all that. But if you're a teacher, you can help your students. You'll see those students who are hyperflexible. And I literally will say, if we're to pose, and let's say Skandasana, which is a side lunge where you can go into where your hips all the way down towards the floor. If you're super flexible, you can go all the way down and just hang out. I'm like, this is easy. You can hang out here. Can you lift your hips up 1 inch and hold that position? So I'll say, if you're all the way down here, try lifting your hips up and holding that position. Then that person who's hyperflexible, who is just hanging out, is now engaged, and they're getting much more proprioceptive feedback. Their muscles are telling them where they are, than if they just kind of gone to extreme. So I will literally kind of educate them as they're practicing how to feel more, how to prevent overstretching in those different poses where they are able to do that.
So luckily we have you teaching a course where you're going to break all of this down, called Slow Aging, Improve Wellbeing and Enhance Performance, How to Maximize the Benefits of Stretching, where I assume you're going to show what you were just talking about, some of that. Can you just talk about what you cover in this course?
Yes, in this course, I start out with the science, because I think it's helpful to know the why behind the how. So we start out with the science, just kind of exploring some of the things that have been found in the last 20 years as far as what different types of stretching are actually doing. And we also look at 6 different types of stretching and how to do that. Because for myself, I was just curious. That's when I usually teach a course, is when I'm curious about it. So I'll research it and figure it out and then teach others. So we'll look at, well, I found 6 different types of stretching that are most commonly done in just life, not only yoga. So we'll look at that. And then we also have a practice where we incorporate that together, the different types of stretching, and actually practice, how do you cue it? How does it feel in our bodies? And when would you use this type versus another type in your yoga asana practice?
And someone I can see this being very useful for a teacher. I can also see someone who's a student who has either a tendency to overdo it or be afraid of their bodies, would also learn how they can modify their practice, even if they're in a yoga class, how they can hold in their minds, this is how I need to work my body.
Yes, exactly. So you'll be more educated as a yoga student to know when to push, when not to push, how to release, what techniques to use for if you're more stiff in your body, what techniques can you use to mitigate that overwhelming feeling of, oh, it's tight, versus I'm lengthening, I'm opening, I'm releasing. So you're using your yoga tools of breath and mindfulness to help you with all those things.
Also, oftentimes people have overstretched and they feel tight. And what they need to do is strengthen, not lengthen. Do these techniques help you to both decipher where you are on that scale and figure out a technique?
Yeah, so in the practice, we go through, trying to, let's say you're doing a seated forward fold. Can you first sit up in staff pose with your back straight? If you can, great, then you're at the place where you can start to hinge forward and lengthen in that pose. Perhaps you're focusing on the back of the legs. But if you're sitting and your back is rounded, then maybe your low back is already in a stretched position. So how can you get in a posture where your low back muscles aren't overstretched as you fold forward? And we show how you can just lift your hips up on an elevated surface. That puts your spine in a neutral position. Then you can move into the stretch without overstretching an area that's already probably weak and overstretched and needs to be strengthened by holding your back straight.
I think that rounded lower back is ubiquitous. And a lot of people fix it by hunching over and trying to do the forward fold from like their upper bodies. And so that kind of a nuance or that kind of an awareness would be really awesome to have.
Yeah, and I think, there's different, let's look at 2 forward folds. You have your Dandasana, where you're focusing more on really the hamstrings and you're bending at the hip joint. So you're more like 90 degrees. But we do have a great benefit and need for lengthening the whole back side of our body. So that would be more of a yin pose, where you're supported in forward flexion and you're purposefully allowing your back and your upper back and your whole back body to flex and round, because you're more addressing the fascia, the connective tissue. So that's a supported position. So they're 2 different purposes, and that's where the student especially can be educated. Is like, okay, I want to do it this way when I'm focusing on the back of my leg, but if I just want to release the whole back side of my body and kind of let go of all that tension in the back side, then I'm going to be supported in a yin pose and allow that back to be flexed on purpose.
Yeah, that's a really empowering notion, that you can know what purpose you're serving when you're doing a pose. I think a lot of people go into yoga classes and they just follow.
Of course.
And they don't. Yeah. So this is really, sounds very valuable.
Well, thank
I
you.
am looking forward to your course. Thank you so much for talking with us and dispelling a few of the myths about forward folding and all of those other great things around stretching. So bottom line, stretching is good, but too much of the wrong kind of anything is not great.
Everything in moderation, brahmacharya.
Moderation. Thank you so much, Chrys, and we'll see you in class.
Okay, great.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.